Good day. I am Dr. Joan Su, a lead faculty in this case study. I team up with my colleague Dr. Ken Tsai. And my students, Shiloh, Jessica, Haley, we are from Iowa State University. We are here today to present to you about an over-tourism issue that we feel is of great importance. Our objective is to present this issue to you in order to better educate future tourism and hospitality leaders on a very important tourism concern. We want to take this opportunity to thank you, the ICHRIE, for allowing us to present our case virtually. Our topic today is, are we putting our favorite destination in peril? A no longer lost city, Machu Picchu case study. This slide is the presentation structure with a table of contents. We will introduce you to the case study first. The teaching notes to follow.
Machu Picchu has developed to become a major source of revenue for Peru and an iconic archaeological site. Machu Picchu was built by the Incas to become one of the most beautiful and luxurious cities of the Incan Empire in the mid-1400s. After being rediscovered, tourists were intrigued by this mysterious landmark and began to travel to Machu Picchu. In 1984, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, also known as UNESCO, named Machu Picchu a World Heritage Site. In 2007, Machu Picchu was also labeled one of the new 7 wonders of the world. From these labels and an influx of tourists, Machu Picchu became a major source of income for the Peruvian government. However, this popularity created a large surge of over-tourism and made a lasting negative impact on Machu Picchu's environment. Over-tourism in Machu Picchu has caused the natural environment and ruins to be degraded by tourists and the sacred city to be disrespected. UNESCO has tried to take steps to protect what is left of Machu Picchu while protecting the ruins and respecting the sacredness of the site in order to prevent erosion of the mountainside. The Peruvian government, however, was still allowing millions of tourists to explore this site. UNESCO had to then threaten the Peruvian government to enforce regulations, otherwise they would place Machu Picchu on their endangered list, meaning tourism would be discontinued and the site would shut down, leaving no opportunities for the government to gain any revenue. Since then, the Peruvian government has made some progress in creating ways to limit tourist visitations and restore Machu Picchu's environment, while still making a profit. Machu Picchu is a Quechua word that comes from Machu, which means older ancient, and Picchu, meaning mountain. Therefore, Machu Picchu translates as Old Mountain. Machu Picchu is a 15th century Incan site located on a ridge between the Huayna Picchu and the Machu Picchu mountains in Peru. Pachayuki Inca Yupanqui, the 9th ruler of the Incas, supposedly built Machu Picchu in the mid-1400s. All Incan sites, complexes, monuments, and sites are intertwined with one another. The Incans did not use any machinery or tools on any of the infrastructures they built. The Incans highly valued architecture, with their temple being oriented to catch the rays of the rising sun and the slopes reflecting Huayna Picchu. All of these combinations have made Machu Picchu a cultural and sacred site. In 1572, the fall of the last Incan capital occurred, and Machu Picchu did not survive this collapse. The Incas' line of rulers came to an end and Machu Picchu fell into ruin. However, in 1911, Yale professor and explorer Hiram Bingham III, while seeking for the lost capital city of the Incas, was brought to Machu Picchu by a local guide. When rediscovered, Machu Picchu was overgrown with vegetation, completely untouched. This was an important fact because it meant that the Spanish never penetrated this ancient city, leaving intact the indications of the Incas' civilization. After his discovery, Bingham immediately contacted Yale University, National Geographic, and the Peruvian government to gain donations to further his studies. From 1912 to 1915, a thorough survey of Machu Picchu commenced. The National Geographic magazine created a detailed article about the development and research of Machu Picchu in the Incan civilization. This article was the first public appearance of Machu Picchu to an international audience. The audience was informed about this discovery, marking the beginning of tourism in Machu Picchu. Ever since this discovery, millions of tourists have traveled from across the world to see the ancient ruins of the city.
To expand on the concept of over-tourism, we must first define this clunky word. The word describes a visitor influx that overwhelms local conditions. The reasoning for over-tourism in many popular tourist attractions, such as Machu Picchu, is driven directly from the economic surplus. And we believe that over-tourism is responsible for these negative impacts made on the environment. The economy is booming while the environment is suffering. We believe that over-tourism is a direct reflection. However, the economy is one of the only variables that actually is surviving. And so Peru relies heavily on tourists, spending their money on souvenirs and different outings. But we contribute the over-tourism to the lack of limitations and restrictions on the environment, specifically those surrounding trails, transportation to and from Machu Picchu on this historical ground. There are lasting repercussions that Peru as a country will endure. Without any proposed plans in place, there quite literally may not be Machu Picchu. The lasting damage left on this site is through significant demands in visiting hours and transportation to and from the site. The trails specifically that lead up to Machu Picchu are in disarray as thousands of tourists trample through the wildlife on their voyage to the site. One article even expresses how there has been souvenirs in the shops down at the bottom of the mountain that are from the mountaintops itself in the native culture, like the butterfly wings. This is not only cruel, but it's a disrespect to the environment and the culture, as it describes the greed of this town. So the value of the ancient civilization and the wildlife that encompasses the surrounding environment is priceless in comparison to capitalizing on tourists through souvenirs. Here we have the theoretical framework that describes the profit, the people, and the planet. So for profit, one of the main dilemmas that Peru has encountered is that they have been able to accumulate a lot of profit from the tourists. Tourism in Peru does not necessarily have a negative effect, like I had mentioned. There has been actually an additional 3,600 jobs that were created in and around the surrounding areas of Machu Picchu. This has brought 165 million income revenue directly to the households and wages. Considering that this is some of these families' sole primary source of revenue, the local businesses can generate a living and have no real reason to leave. Many natives in the surrounding area have picked up their lives to actually move to Machu Picchu to serve the tourists and to earn an income. People is the second one, and the relationships between the Peruvian natives and the tourists has actually created a division amongst cultures. Natives consider this site a pilgrimage to travel to pay respects to their ruler. Many roads that lead to Machu Picchu, with the most important one being named the Inca Trail, has been completely trashed from the tourists. The history of these trails remains second scarce reasons as to why the natives will visit this site. The site itself resembles the peak power of the Incan ruler. And with that being said, the tensions between tourists and natives are increasing. So for the planet, tourists from all over the world come to visit and they leave their trash, they litter. And not only that, it has created a division between the cultures. So the planet itself is suffering. The Peruvian government has faced a long history of this type of vandalism on this site. Specifically, back in January of 2020, 4 men and 2 women from Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and France were caught around 6 o'clock in the morning at this famous Incan sanctuary. They had been caught vandalizing the rocks, spray painting the boulders, and completely trashing this historic site. This type of vandalism is irreplaceable, and archaeologists struggle to remove paint that was used from the graffiti. After this incident, a series of proposals have been put into place as of this last year to protect this site, which includes placing cable cars and tunnels access to and from the valley, They have also established that vandalism from public, if it continues to destroy the site, the government has established taking actions for either jail time or deportation of the individuals who purposely harm the site.
We have created a list of recommended actions to help preserve the land, economy, and environment of Machu Picchu. Our first recommendation is to travel by train. Most well-known effects of transportation on the environment include carbon dioxide emissions and pollution into the air. Studies show that on average, trains are 4 times more fuel efficient than trucks. Travel to Machu Picchu by train will benefit Peru by having cleaner air, less traffic, and less contributions to global warming. Next, we encourage placing further restrictions on the site. This can be done by hiring more guards to protect the sacred ruins. We also recommend closing off trails with more than simple signage or tape. This will help closed-off trails have more time to be restored and native vegetation replenished. Throughout peak seasons, the Peruvian government can change which trails are used every couple of months to reduce the amount of foot traffic and soil erosion in the area, as well as have more control over the crowd surplus. In addition, visiting hours will be held so that the site can be restored during off-peak seasons. It is imperative that the site has time to be restored and cultivate naturally. Machu Picchu also requires necessary time off from tourists. There is much frustration from residents as tourists visit all year round and place their effects on the environment. It is vital for the health and well-being of locals to allow certain visiting hours only. A possible effect of restricting Machu Picchu's visiting hours would be an increase in price of admission, as well as a limited number of seats on the train. This adjustment allows revenue to be maximized and still benefit the economy with less strain on the environment. A final recommendation is providing Machu Picchu blackout dates. This means that the site will be closed off to the public and no one is able to visit during these times. This recommendation will force tourists to adhere to the rules of when they are allowed and not allowed on the site. The Peruvian government should have control over these blackout dates to their own benefit. The blackout dates allow for the environment to be maintained by the locals as previously mentioned.
In conclusion, we believe that tourists need to be more aware of their actions and how they negatively impact popular sites such as Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu has undergone significant environmental damage to the landscape and to the ruins by people's footsteps, garbage, and heinous acts such as vandalism, defecation, and ignorance. The Peruvian government has also taken part in the destruction of Machu Picchu by allowing a surplus of tourists to venture onto the site, as well as allowing commercial development in the area such as restaurants, shops, and hotels. The actions from the tourists and the Peruvian government have caused a divide between the locals, government, UNESCO, and the tourists. UNESCO is still trying to prevent the destruction of Machu Picchu, a World Heritage Site, only with the compliance and help from the government. However, with the recommendations provided, Machu Picchu should be able to regain the vegetation and beauty it once had and still maintain its booming tourist attraction. The Peruvian government still expects Machu Picchu to remain a significant tourist destination while respecting the Incan culture and the ancient city ruins. While Machu Picchu brings in the largest share of Peru's hospitality and tourism revenue, the government has failed to oversee the location adequately. Since it is such a hotspot for tourists, the ancient ruins of Machu Picchu are getting pushed over, broken, vandalized, and defecated on. The tourists are not only destroying the ruins, but also the environment, specifically the vegetation and soil that surrounds and leads up to this archaeological site. These actions caused by the tourists and the inattention of the Peruvian government have created a rift between the locals, tourists, government, and UNESCO. UNESCO, as a result, threatened the Peruvian government and said that if the government does not take actions to help protect Machu Picchu, it will then be placed on their endangered list and be officially closed off to the public, thereby eliminating this important source of revenue. Therefore, the Peruvian government took some steps in restricting Machu Picchu's access from tourists. However, from viewing the Peruvian government's initiatives, more recommendations surfaced. This included measures to restore the vegetation and soil, protect the ruins, have better crowd control, reduce carbon emissions, and maintain a decent revenue stream. For vegetation and soil restoration and protection of the ruins, we recommended placing more guards around the site, restricting tourists from certain areas for growth purposes, and only opening up a couple of paths to Machu Picchu. Managing the number of paths also helps with crowd control, as well as allowing certain paths to have time for rest and restoration. We also focused on the transportation access to the site. We recommended that only one form of transportation, trains, should be allowed to reach Machu Picchu. This will coincide with the seasonal times that tourists will be able to visit this site. All of the recommendations are to help benefit the locals, tourists, and government while still maintaining the specific requirements enforced by UNESCO. As the initiatives continue to protect Machu Picchu, it is expected to remain a popular tourist destination, as well as being more respectful and mindful of the history and culture behind these ruins and environment.
We have developed teaching objectives for our audience, such as the following: identify and understand the environmental impacts of over-tourism at Machu Picchu, analyze the current actions being taken at Machu Picchu, discriminate and develop strategies to balance people, planet, and profit at Machu Picchu, and evaluate and implement strategies to encourage sustainability and social responsibility in your own life.
We aimed for this case study to reach undergraduate students at a higher level course. It is also apparent that the locals, tourists, and government have played in the ongoing damage of Machu Picchu's environment and ancient ruins. So, even if we cannot directly target these audiences, we hope our case study can reach any and all tourists visiting Machu Picchu, locals living or working in the area of Machu Picchu, the Peruvian government, guards and guides who are employed at this site, and anyone who wants to protect ancient and renowned archaeological sites, such as UNESCO.
This case study could require multiple sessions and be taught in many different ways. With this said, 3-hour teaching sessions should suffice for students learning the case study. In the first hour session, the instructor may want to talk about over-tourism and how it affects the hospitality and tourism industry. More specifically, the instructor can help students understand this topic by providing industry examples, such as world-famous sites other than Machu Picchu. A great teaching method to use for this would be a visual presentation. Instead of just talking about over-tourism examples, it will be necessary to show before and after visuals representing the effects of over-tourism. Then, the second hour session should include major facts and visuals of the Machu Picchu site. In order for them to dig deeply into the case study, they must know and have a mental image of what goes on in Machu Picchu, the background behind it, and be introduced to its current situation today. It would be wise to show a timeline of how Machu Picchu was discovered and protected over all these years. It is also important to talk about the time when Machu Picchu was declared one of the new 7 wonders of the world. The final session should then combine the 2 previous sessions into a final discussion about issues connecting the 2 topics. The session should start out with ways that over-tourism is impacting Machu Picchu today. The students can then brainstorm their own ways to see an improvement to this issue. Once students have been given enough time to brainstorm recommendations of their own, the class should come together as a whole and sit in a circle-style layout. This way, the instructor can incorporate an interactive component, such as a small ball or talking stick, as a way that students can share their ideas when they receive the object. Some examples of discussion questions in the group can be: do you think Peru has a good handle on the issue of sustainability and over-tourism? Why or why not? Should Peru be communicating with other nations in regard to the over-tourism crisis? And lastly, how can the preservation of Machu Picchu be fully respected by tourists?
The current dilemma is that Machu Picchu is dealing with over-tourism and acts of vandalism to this site. So we have established a should, a how, and a what to address this type of situation. Peru should be communicating with other nations regarding over-tourism crisis. We believe that yes, Peru needs to be contacting other national parks that are dealing with similar dilemmas. For example, Venice, Italy, is also going through some situation with over-tourism as the city is actually crumbling down, and in the future there soon might not even be a Venice. So how? Peru needs to put in place some preservation to be fully respected by tourists. The preservation of Machu Picchu can be fully respected by tourists who understand the actual history of this ancient site. And as we know, it's not going to be here forever, similar to Venice, Italy, if tourists continue to destroy this ancient and historical land. One way to help with the preservation is having tour guides explaining the importance of the preservation and how we all play a huge part in this effect. We believe that doing so will actually be of aid to the Machu Picchu government in order to preserve this site. What is going to take to decrease over-tourism in Peru? Well, it will take a group effort to decrease the amount of times travelers visit, and it will actually take collaboration between the government and the tourist in understanding the importance of seasonal blackout dates and limitation visits per day. As we've established, the Peruvian government has already put in place these types of restrictions. However, we do believe that there needs to be a clear, distinguished communication amongst the government and the tourists.
As we bring our presentation to a close, we once again thank you for watching our presentation and hope this case study has given you a much clearer understanding of the over-tourism issue, which was presented. We will welcome the opportunity to return with another student group to present a different tourism and hospitality issues in the near future. Thank you.